Maya Reeves had spent 9 years reading lies for the FBI. Nothing prepared her for walking into a beautiful, award-winning care facility and realizing that every smile inside it was rehearsed. Her grandmother was in there, and she was running out of time. The drive from Portland to Millhaven took 3 hours on a good day. She had been making it in silence for 2, her hands steady on the wheel of her black Subaru while gray Oregon sky pressed flat against the windshield. 6 months of mandatory leave had a particular texture, not restful, not healing, just suspended. Like being held underwater long enough to forget what air tasted like. She had spent 9 years with the FBI learning to read rooms, read faces, read the half-second delay between a question and a lie. Then came the Harlow case, a 7-year-old girl, a warehouse in southeast Portland. 48 hours too late. The bureau psychologist had used words like acute stress response and compassion fatigue. She stopped. But stopping didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying everything in a quieter room. From the back seat, Rook shifted his weight and pressed his broad nose briefly against the back of her headrest. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, amber-eyed and thick-coated, with the particular stillness of a dog trained to observe more than react. He had found a missing child under 3 feet of rubble in Eugene. He had sat outside interrogation rooms and growled once, softly, every time someone inside was lying. Maya had learned to trust that growl the way other people trusted weather forecasts. Not perfectly, but enough to carry an umbrella. She reached back and touched his ear without looking. Almost there, buddy. Rook didn't settle. He stayed upright, watching the road ahead with an alertness she recognized but couldn't yet name. The wooden sign for Cedar View Care Center appeared through the trees. Compassionate living for every season of life. The parking lot was clean, the landscaping deliberate, the building warm-lit behind tall windows. Everything about it said, nothing to worry about here. A bronze plaque beside the entrance read, Oregon Care Excellence Award, 3 consecutive years. Rook made a sound low in his throat, not a growl. Something quieter. Something that made Maya's hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel before she even knew why. The automatic doors opened with a soft exhale of heated air carrying disinfectant, lavender diffuser oil, and something underneath both of those things that Maya's nose cataloged automatically, the specific staleness of a space where windows were rarely opened. Sandra Voss crossed the lobby before Maya had fully stepped inside. She was 60, composed in the way of someone who had practiced composure until it became indistinguishable from personality. Silver-streaked hair cut precisely at the jaw, a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, reading glasses tucked into her breast pocket like a prop. Her smile arrived at exactly the right speed. Maya, we're so glad you could make it. The handshake was firm, brief, calibrated. Your grandmother has been talking about your visit all week. Maya watched Sandra's eyes during the greeting. Not the words, not the smile, but the eyes, and noticed something she filed away without reacting to. Sandra already knew about the Harlow case. She mentioned it 3 sentences in, expressing sympathy with the fluency of someone who had researched it beforehand. Not the public details, the specific interdepartmental delay that never made the news cycle. Maya smiled and said thank you and followed her down the hallway. Rook walked beside Maya's left knee and did something he had never done in 7 years of fieldwork. He stopped walking. Completely. Sat down on the polished floor and refused to move forward. Maya looked at him. His ears were flat, his body low, his eyes fixed on the corridor ahead with an expression she had learned to describe in incident reports as passive threat detection. The signal for a danger that wasn't active yet but was present and waiting. He's protective, Sandra said lightly. That's sweet. Maya gave the release command quietly. Rook obeyed, but he didn't relax. He walked the rest of the hallway with his body slightly angled, always positioning himself between Maya and the walls, the way he moved through buildings they hadn't yet cleared. Room 14 was warm and pleasant and smelled of Eleanor's hand cream, rose and almond, the same kind for 30 years. Eleanor Reeves sat beside the window in a cushioned chair, a book open in her lap. She looked up when Maya entered and smiled, and said her name, and everything about the moment looked like a reunion. Except Eleanor did not meet Maya's eyes, not once. In 34 years, Eleanor Reeves had never once failed to look her granddaughter directly in the face. Maya came back the next day, and the day after that. She didn't announce she was watching. She sat with Eleanor, walked the common areas with Rook, said good morning to the nurses, and built a picture the way she had always built pictures. Not by asking the loudest questions, but by paying attention to the spaces between answers. The medication cart rolled through the dining hall at 9:15 every evening, 90 minutes earlier than the industry standard. she'd looked up the night before in her rental cabin outside Millhaven. She counted residents who swallowed their cups without looking at the contents. 11 out of 14 on the Tuesday round. Rooms belonging to residents she privately labeled the complainers. She'd heard them express small frustrations over food temperature, over the temperature of the room, over phone access, were located in the eastern corridor, the one segment of the building with no camera coverage visible from the hallway. She noticed that staff members never made direct eye contact with family visitors when Sandra was within 30 feet. Lena Park, a young nurse with careful movements and tired eyes, had twice begun sentences directly to Maya and stopped mid-word, her gaze sliding sideways toward the nurse's station. On Thursday, Maya helped Eleanor to the bathroom and noticed a small rectangular mark on the inside of her grandmother's left wrist, the kind left by medical adhesive removed in haste. She kept her voice even. "Did you fall recently, Grandma?" Eleanor's hand moved behind her back before she answered. The movement was smooth, practiced, and completely unlike anything Eleanor Reeves had ever done in her life. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You worry too much." The words were correct. The reflexive concealment was not. Rook pressed his side gently against Eleanor's leg and stayed there while she settled back into her chair, and Maya stood by the window, looking at the parking lot and understanding. With the cold clarity of someone trained to name things accurately, that her grandmother had been taught to hide things from her. She came back at 10. The official reason, Eleanor's reading glasses, left on the side table. The real reason was Rook, who had spent the evening pacing the cabin in slow circles, pausing each time at the eastern wall as if listening to something through it. The side entrance accepted her keycard. She had asked for extended family access 2 days earlier, and Sandra had approved it with a warm smile that Maya now understood differently. Keeping her close meant keeping her visible. A family member with authorized access was easier to manage than one who found other ways in. Inside, the hallways were dim and nearly silent, the overhead fluorescents replaced by low-base lighting. 2 nurses moved between rooms at the far end of the corridor. Neither looked up. Rook didn't pull toward Eleanor's room. His nose dropped twice to the floor, then lifted, and he turned left toward the wellness wing, the name printed in tasteful sans serif above a set of double doors, and walked with the particular purposeful alignment of his shoulders that Maya recognized from fieldwork. He had caught something on the air. Stress hormones, she knew from training. Fear had a smell, and Rook had been learning it for 7 years. Maya followed. The sound came before the room. Not loud. The sound of someone crying who had stopped expecting to be heard, short, contained, rhythmically controlled, the breathing of a person who had learned that louder crying brought consequences. Room W7. Harold Yates sat in the dark beside his bed with both wrists secured to the wheelchair armrests with soft medical restraints. The kind that left no bruising, the kind that looked like precaution. He was 83 thin, with bright eyes that had not gone dull. When the door opened, he did not flinch. He looked at Maya with the expression of a man who has been doing long arithmetic and has finally arrived at the correct answer. "I've been waiting," he said, "for about 6 months now." He reached beneath his pillow and produced a small composition notebook. He had been writing in it since October, dates, names, room numbers, descriptions, hiding it each morning inside the dust jacket of his Bible. Rook sat at the old man's feet and did not move. Lena Park found Maya in the parking lot the following evening at shift change. She was still in her scrubs, standing in the cold without a coat, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision during a sleepless night and was afraid that daylight might change her mind. She spoke quickly and quietly with her back to the building's exterior cameras, and Maya listened without interrupting. The medication system ran on 2 tracks. The official record, filed, time-stamped, submitted for state inspection, documented standard doses, standard frequencies, standard protocols. The secondary system had no paperwork. It operated verbally, shift to shift, through a rotation of 3 nurses who administered additional sedation after 11 p.m. The purpose, as Lena understood it, was described internally as overnight behavior management. The effect was that residents who had complained during the day, or who had requested phone access, or who had asked questions about their billing statements, did not repeat those behaviors the following morning. 4 months ago, a woman named Doris Cantwell had died in a fall in the east bathroom. Her family received a check for $8,000 and a non-disclosure agreement they signed without legal counsel, believing it was a standard liability release. Sandra had told them it was routine. Lena handed Maya an envelope. Inside was a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 5 months earlier. Written during a window when the sedation schedule had been briefly suspended, Lena explained that the overnight doses were sometimes skipped for 2 or 3 days when state inspectors were expected. And Eleanor had used that window, written in the clear, deliberate cursive of a woman who had graded papers for 40 years. If Maya comes, give this to her. Tell her I am not confused. Tell her I know exactly where I am. I know what is happening, and I am waiting for her to see it. Maya read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in her jacket pocket against her chest. Rook sat beside her in the cold and leaned his full weight against her leg. Frank Doyle worked out of a shared office on the second floor that smelled of old coffee and overdue file folders. The particular habitat of a person who had been trying to fix something bureaucratic for long enough the effort had become a form of endurance rather than optimism. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with a voice designed for reassuring people in crisis and eyes shaped by too many times when reassurance hadn't been enough. He had submitted a formal internal report to the Oregon State Health Authority 18 months ago. 7 pages, documented, sourced, specific. He had received an acknowledgement of receipt and nothing else. Maya sat across from him and laid the medication logs Lena had provided on the desk between them. Frank looked at them for a long time before speaking. The board member who chairs the Care Facility Oversight Committee, he said, has a 14% stake in Ridgeline Health Partners. He paused. Ridgeline owns Cedarview and 3 other facilities in the state. Maya kept her face still. No one disclosed that? The disclosure form exists, Frank said. It was filed. It's technically public record. He looked at her steadily. Nobody looked. That evening, Maya knocked on the door of the physician's lounge and found Dr. Owen Marsh alone at a table with an untouched cup of coffee and the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he had already accepted. She did not present evidence. She did not make accusations. She said, I don't think you're here because you wanted to be. Marsh was quiet for a long time. Rook had followed Maya to the door and was sitting just outside it in the hallway, not growling, not alerting, simply present. And for reasons Marsh could not fully articulate later, it was the dog's quiet patience that broke something loose in him. He talked for 40 minutes. Sandra had discovered a prescribing error from 3 years earlier, a genuine mistake, not malice, the kind that happened in overworked private practice. No patient had been seriously harmed, but it was enough. She had never asked for money, only for compliance, renewable indefinitely, backed by the silent threat of a document she kept in a locked drawer. That was the lesson, Maya thought. The most effective control never looks like control. Sandra moved on a Wednesday. Maya recognized it in the morning, a slight recalibration in the administrator's manner. The warmth dialed up precisely 2 degrees. The eye contact held 1 second longer than necessary. The behavior of someone who had made a decision and was now managing the aftermath of it in advance. By afternoon, Maya received a call from a Portland attorney she had never met, informing her that Cedarview's legal team had documented 3 instances of unauthorized access to patient areas and was prepared to file for a restraining order on grounds of harassment and emotional disturbance of vulnerable residents. 2 hours later, her former bureau psychologist called. He was apologetic, careful, clearly uncomfortable. Sandra Voss had contacted his office with welfare concerns regarding Maya's mental stability, citing specific language from his confidential post-Harlow assessment report, language that had never appeared in any public record. Maya sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and worked through the architecture of what had just happened. Sandra hadn't simply defended herself. She had studied Maya, accessed protected documents through a channel Maya hadn't yet identified. And then, Maya remembered. The board member with the 14% stake in Ridgeline had spent 11 years as a state-level liaison to federal law enforcement before moving into healthcare. Investment. That was the thread. That was how. She had constructed a preemptive narrative in which Maya's testimony would be filtered through a lens of psychological unreliability before it reached anyone with authority to act. It was a clean move. Maya recognized it with the detached appreciation of someone who had watched interrogation subjects do the same thing. Attack the credibility of the witness rather than the substance of the evidence. What Maya didn't know until Frank Doyle told her the following week, the Attorney General's office had quietly opened a preliminary review that same afternoon, triggered by a complaint filed not by Maya but by Harold Yates's daughter in Seattle, who had been trying to reach her father for 9 days and had finally called a lawyer. Sandra had learned about it through the same network that had given her Maya's psychological file. She had approximately 6 hours to move the most vocal residents before the review became official. That was why the van came at night. Not panic. Calculation miscalculated. Then, at 11:40 p.m., Rook woke her from a half-sleep in the cabin with a single sharp bark and pressed his nose to the window facing the road. A white medical transport van was parked at Cedarview's rear service entrance. Maya was in her car in 4 minutes. She pulled up at the service entrance and opened her phone's camera. Not to record privately, she went live, a 7-second decision driven by the understanding that a former FBI agent confronting a care facility administrator at midnight needed witnesses who existed outside the reach of attorneys and board members. She called Daniel Cho, a reporter at the Millhaven Courier she had worked with on a fraud case 18 months earlier. He answered on the second ring and stayed on the line. The van's side door was open. 2 orderlies and a woman in administrative clothing Maya didn't recognize were loading a wheelchair-accessible ramp into the vehicle. Sandra appeared from the rear entrance in a coat over her blazer, and when she saw the phone's screen glow and the red recording indicator, something happened in her face that Maya had been trained to read and had never seen Sandra produce before. Unmediated reaction. Raw, unscheduled, real. "You need to stop," Sandra said. Her voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone entirely. Stripped away like paint from something underneath that was harder and colder and more honest. "You are a mentally compromised individual harassing a licensed care facility." The rear door of the van opened from the inside. Eleanor Reeves stepped out. Not pushed, not assisted. She stepped down onto the pavement by herself, slowly, both hands on the doorframe, her white hair loose around her shoulders, wearing her blue robe over her nightgown. She stood in the cold, and for a moment she swayed slightly, one hand still on the doorframe, her eyes finding the ground before finding Sandra. The cold air seemed to help. She had not been given her 11 o'clock dose. Maya would learn later that the orderlies had skipped it to keep her ambulatory for the transfer. Eleanor straightened. She looked at Sandra Voss with the full, undistracted attention of a woman who had spent 4 decades watching children learn to tell the truth and could recognize a lie at considerable distance. "I taught school for 40 years, Eleanor said. Her voice, at first thin, steadied as she spoke. "I know every student I ever had by name. Don't you ever mistake my age for my absence." Rook walked to Eleanor's side and sat. The live feed had 400 viewers. Within the hour, it had 11,000. The public hearing before the Oregon State Health Authority took place on a Thursday in late March, 11 weeks after the night at the service entrance. The intervening time had not been quiet. Emergency state receivership had been imposed on the Ridgeline network within 72 hours of the live recording, and the 4 facilities had been operating under state-appointed administrators since the 3rd week of January. The hearing was the formal record, not the beginning of the response. The room held 200 people and had standing space only by 9 a.m. Frank Doyle testified first, presenting his 18-month-old report alongside the updated documentation, the dual medication system, the altered incident records, the non-disclosure payment to Doris Cantwell's family, the board members' undisclosed financial stake in Ridgeline Health Partners. Lena Park testified second. Her hands shook through the first page of her statement and steadied by the third. She spoke for 22 minutes without looking away from the panel. Dr. Marsh testified third, having submitted his full cooperation to the Attorney General's office 4 days prior. He described the prescribing error, the document Sandra had kept, and 3 years of compliance. He did not attempt to minimize his role. He said, "I told myself I was protecting my patients by staying. I was protecting myself. I need to be accurate about that." Harold Yates testified last. He came in his wheelchair, the composition notebook in his lap, and read from it in the methodical, unhurried cadence of a man who had spent a career making complex ideas comprehensible to 20-year-olds. He read dates, names, specific incidents. Then he closed the notebook and looked at the panel and said, "Philosophy teaches us that a society is measured by how it treats those who can no longer advocate for themselves. I am not here as a victim. I am here as a witness to a system that requires repair, not punishment of one person, but structural repair, because what happened to me is happening in other buildings with different names on the sign." Eleanor Reeves stood at the end of the session without being asked. She had spent 5 months, she told the panel, being systematically convinced that her own perceptions were unreliable. "The most frightening moment," she said quietly, "was not the restraints, not the medication, not the isolation. It was the morning I woke up and thought, perhaps they are right, perhaps I am confused. That is what cruelty at its most sophisticated looks like. It makes you doubt yourself before it needs to do anything else." Sandra Voss was arrested on a Friday. The charges included elder abuse, healthcare fraud, unlawful restraint, and witness intimidation. The Ridgeline Health Partners Network, 4 facilities across Oregon and Washington remained under emergency state receivership and entered formal federal investigation following the hearing. Dr. Marsh's license was suspended pending a formal review board hearing. His full cooperation was entered into the record. Frank Doyle was appointed as lead investigator to a special review panel operating under emergency authority from the governor's office, a body that could be assembled within days under existing statute, with a mandate to produce the structural framework for a permanent elder care reform commission within 90 days. Lena Park returned to nursing. She left a note on the bulletin board in the break room that said, "If you see something, there is someone to call." Harold Yates was invited to address the state legislature's health committee in May. He accepted. He brought the notebook. Maya drove Eleanor home on a Sunday. The cabin was small, pine-framed, set back from the road in the trees east of Millhaven, and Maya had spent 3 days making it ready without mentioning it. Widened doorways, a grab bar beside the shower, a ramp at the back door. When Eleanor saw the curtains in the small rear bedroom, pale green, the specific shade she had kept in her kitchen window from 1987 until the year she moved into assisted living, she stopped walking and stood still for a long moment. "How did you know that color?" Maya looked at the floor. "You taught me that remembering the details of the people you love isn't sentiment. It's how you tell them they matter." Eleanor placed one hand against her granddaughter's face and held it there without speaking. Rook walked to the bedroom, turned 2 circles, lay down on the floor beside Eleanor's chair, and closed his eyes. He was still for the first time in months, not alert, not waiting, not monitoring, simply resting, his breathing long and slow in the quiet room. 3 months later, a family in Bend called the nonprofit Maya had registered in the weeks after the hearing. Their father was in a facility 2 counties over. He had stopped speaking much, but the week before, he had taken his son's hand and whispered, "Is someone coming? I'm afraid." Maya read the message. She looked at Rook. The dog was already on his feet. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and which moment hit you the hardest.
We teach children to speak up when something is wrong, but somewhere along the way, we forgot to protect the one who can no longer speak loudly enough to be heard. Eleanor did lost her mind, she lost her origin. They are different, and the difference really cost her everything. The most sophisticated curry doesn't come with release. It comes with a smell as exactly the right speed. It comes with lavender, diffused oil, and a warm winning larvae and a warm hand snake. It's conveying the variable that she all basically are broken, that she fear is condition, that she silently is. Here was a story teacher. The people who love someone as the last line or befriend, not the student, not the paperwork, not the expectation, skiller. The person who knows kid that grandma stop looking them in the ear. Pay attention to the smell thing, the relative teacher, the hand that moved before the warm comes, the dog who walked out the hall. And if something feels wrong, just start feeling the make away. May I just not perfectly, but enough to stay, enough to keep coming back, enough to ask one more question because somewhere right now, someone is living in the dark waiting to be found. Don't make the mistake